Good morning, everyone. It's so great to be here with you live and in person today. I'm Stephanie Bowman. I'm the past treasurer of LPC and also known as the mom to Maddie and Luke Farwell, wife to David, who are watching us at home online. Thank you, Bob Ferguson, for the opportunity to do this special introduction today. I'm delighted to be here with you on this Affirm Sunday, and especially to have the privilege of introducing our special speaker, Kathleen Wynne. I know Kathleen is known to many of you as the MPP here in Don Valley West, and also as Ontario's 25th Premier. Kathleen has also become a great source of guidance and support to me as I embark on a political journey as well. Kathleen was first elected to the Ontario Legislature in 2003 as the MPP for Don Valley West, and she became the leader of the Ontario Liberal Party in January 2013. She has dedicated her professional life to building a better province for the people of Ontario. She and her government were guided by the values and principles that knit this province together: fairness, diversity, collaboration, and creativity, also all well and alive here at Lawrence Park Community Church. Kathleen served as minister in several portfolios before she became Premier. In her role as Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, she worked in partnership with First Nations communities to address issues such as mining development, First Nations land claims, and improving quality of life for Indigenous people living off reserve through affordable housing and recreation programs. As Minister of Education, Kathleen led the government's efforts to reduce class sizes, implement full-day kindergarten, and provide more opportunities for high school students to reach their full potential. She served as a public school trustee in Toronto, led citizens groups in a number of grassroots community projects, and played a role as a major organizer and facilitator. This experience contributed to her results-based approach to life, to government, and to community. On a personal side, Kathleen has 3 adult children, Chris, Jesse, and Maggie, and 4 grandchildren, who I know she spends a lot of time with now and is enjoying that: Olivia, Claire, Hugh, and Violet. Before moving to Alliston, Kathleen and her partner Jane lived in North Toronto for more than 30 years. Kathleen, thank you for being here with us today. We are so excited to hear you speak on this important day for Lawrence Park Community Church as we become an affirming congregation.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and it's a great pleasure to know you, and it's a great pleasure to be here with everyone today. Thank you so much for inviting me. I have been in this room many times. I will say not for as pleasant an occasion. No one's yelling at me today, so. It's really humbling to be here this morning. It's a pleasure to have been asked to speak at your affirming ceremony. Congratulations to all of you at Lawrence Park Community Church. I know that becoming an affirming congregation it's a journey. And I've heard you say it's 3 years, and that's 3 years of a lot of work. Those emails signify that. But there's a lot of soul searching that goes on, and there are difficult conversations that happen during an affirming process. And I know we've got some lovely members from Fairlawn United, which is my home church, and we went through the same kind of process, and I believe every church does, but it is so worth it. And so I just want to congratulate you for doing that. I've had the privilege of speaking at a number of affirming ceremonies, services, and I've always had Jane with me, my partner Jane, but she couldn't come this morning. But as Stephanie said, we have lived in, until we moved a year ago to Alliston, I lived in North Toronto since 1982, and I basically have been a member of Fairlawn United Church and continue to be a member of Fairlawn United Church to this day. And Jane and I were married at Fairlawn, and Jane was very much much a part of the affirming process of that church. We are blessed to live in a country and in a province and in a city and to belong to churches where it is safe for me, an openly lesbian politician, to address you and to celebrate your embrace of the LGBTQ2S+ community. We are blessed. And I just want to tell you that I've told you that I've spoken at a number of services, and so when Stephanie approached me and asked me about doing this, I went back and got out my notes from those other services, and I changed them a bit, and I wrote it all out. And then this morning, I was awake at 5 o'clock because we weren't sure whether Eid was going to be this morning or tomorrow morning, so I was getting ready to either get in the car to go to the mosque or wait just to come here, and it turns out Eid is tomorrow morning. But in those sort of early morning hours, I was thinking about what I wanted to say today, and I'm not going to use my speech, so I'll give it to you in paper if you want it, Stephen. You can, whatever. But I decided that there were a couple of other things that I wanted to say to you. So the first thing I want to say is I want to pose a question. Because the reading was sitting with me, the admonition that we love our neighbors as ourselves, which I know is at the base of so much of what we believe as Christians. In the current context today, and with the lived experience that I'm going to talk a little bit about, having gone through nearly 22 years of elected office, I have a really deep question about, if we don't love ourselves, how do we love our neighbors? And I have experienced many, many people in my political career and in communities across the country, across the province, who are so angry and they're so disenchanted with their own lives. And I really worry that they're having trouble loving themselves. And I think that has implications for us as people who believe that loving our neighbors as ourselves and being inclusive and being one with God, that's a challenge if we're living in a society where somehow we're allowing an environment where people are growing up and they don't love themselves. And what does that mean? So I just wanted to pose that question because it was sitting with me, and I have obviously tried to live by and taught my own children and tried to live my political life in that frame of loving our neighbors as ourselves. But I really worry that we're in a moment right now where we've got to ask ourselves what's happening to the people who don't feel like they are part of. The second thing I wanted to point out, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about my own journey that brought me to want to celebrate affirming congregations. I think the moment that we're in right now in the LGBTQ2S+ community is that we've done a lot of work. We've come a very long way. We have laws and we have policies that have changed. And the framework is very strong, I think. That doesn't mean there's compliance. That doesn't mean that there aren't people who are struggling. And I think one of the groups that is struggling the very most right now is the trans community. And I think that we have to examine, each of us, our own attitudes. You know, when I came out to my dad, I was 37 when I came out, living here in North Toronto on Fairlawn Avenue. And my dad was a general practitioner, and unbeknownst to me, when I was a kid and he was a general practitioner in North Toronto, not North Toronto, in Richmond Hill. He grew up on Lytton Boulevard, but he practiced medicine in Richmond Hill. And he had a practice within which there was a large group of gay men who would travel from Toronto to Richmond Hill to see my dad because he got a reputation for being a doctor who he was practicing from 1952 through until the 70s and 80s. But he got a reputation in those early years as someone who would not report the gay men to the police. he would treat them without reporting them. So gay men were driving from Toronto to Richmond Hill, and that was a longer drive in 1960 than it is now, to see my dad. I didn't know any of that when I first came out to him, but when I did come out to him, he said, you know, Kath, this is a deep taboo, and you have to give people time. And what I learned over that coming out process for myself, even though I knew it intellectually, was there's internalized homophobia that we live with, and I think that transphobia is something we haven't even begun to examine as a society, and so I think that that's the moment that we're at right now. And so we can pat ourselves on the back and say we've come all this way, but we have a lot of work to do. And I think it's in that particular area with children in our schools. And I will just say that thank goodness for the sex ed curriculum. And I'm sorry, that's not a political comment, but it is true. I have talked to young kids who, when they are in a conversation or they're questioning what trans means, many of them have had a discussion in school already. They have already been introduced to ideas of difference because of curriculum that is in the school. And I believe that's where attitudes change and start to change, is in schools with kids. Because much as we want to believe our families are open and we talk about everything, we don't. We need support from professionals. So what I want to talk about briefly is this. I want to talk about lightning rods and beacons, because when I was going through those notes that I had written before, one of the changes I made was I wanted to say to you at Lawrence Park Community Church that you are a beacon and that you are leading the way, because even today, when we've come as far as we have, there is such a need for that light in the window for young people, for older people, to know that there's a safe place. Jane and I ran a dance for, well, it was called Mad for Dancing, Middle-Aged Dykes for Dancing. We ran it for 10 years, and we raised money for the Lesbian, Gay, Bi Youth Line. This is years ago. And at that time, we had 800 women on our list. The email would go out at the beginning. We were doing it 3 times a year, and those women would come from all over the province. They would come from Owen Sound. Some of them came out of retirement homes or nursing homes. We had a group of women who would bring an 80-year-old, and the big joke was that the group of women always wanted more chairs than Jane was willing to put out. Jane kept saying, it's a dance. You can't fill the dance floor with chairs because then nobody can dance. But what struck me was that those women were closeted in their lives, but that dance 2 or 3 times a year was a place where they could be themselves. That was a beacon for them. That was a safe place. So for me, you are a beacon, and you are creating a safe space for young and old to know that this is an inclusive place to be. So I want to talk a little bit about my experience of beacons and being a lightning rod, because I believe that sometimes, maybe often, you have to be a lightning rod on the way to being a beacon, or maybe you're a lightning rod and a beacon all at the same time. And there's light and heat in both of those things, and that's okay. But sometimes being a lightning rod can be painful, and I think sometimes people avoid, and organizations avoid, that journey to being a beacon because they don't want to be a lightning rod, and they don't want to put their heads up and take the heat that comes with saying, this is who we are and this is what we believe. So 3 sort of parts of my life I want to talk about. My coming out. I was 37, as I said. My husband at the time, Phil, and I had moved back from Holland. I'd had my first 2 kids in the Netherlands. We moved back from Holland in 1982. I had these 2 little babies. Then we had a 3rd baby. We lived on Fairlawn Avenue, and I joined Fairlawn Church and got involved in the church community. And my life changed around 1990 when I realized who I was. It took me a lot of time, but I got there. But by the time I came out at 37, I was a pretty established, privileged North Toronto woman. A white, fairly affluent woman living in a very almost homogeneous neighborhood at that point. It was pretty much like the Richmond Hill that I had grown up in. And so there were voices that said to Jane and me, this is not going to work. You're going to have to leave the neighborhood because this is going to be just too uncomfortable. And there were moments when, people crossed the street not to talk to me. And the coffee morning that I was part of with my little kids stopped inviting me for a while, and it was very, very painful. But because I was 37, because I had had the privilege that I had had, instead of being cowed or being afraid, I was indignant. I felt, who are you to judge me? Now that's very different than my partner Jane and so many young people who know early. Jane knew when she was 6 years old that she was having feelings that she couldn't talk to her mother about. That was not my experience. And so she had lived a life of adjusting to the homophobia in her world. But I hadn't experienced that. And so my reaction was, I'm going to stay and I'm going to be who I am. And the people around me are going to have to accept that or not. And there were some who did, and there were some who didn't. But at that moment in my life, I wasn't thinking about being a beacon at all. What I felt like was a lightning rod. I felt like there was anger and there was hostility that was coming at us. It manifested sometime in deep concern for Phil, my husband. Was he going to be okay? Because all of a sudden he was surrounded by these horrible women. And he was great. We got through it. It was tough, but we got through it. So that was a lightning rod moment. And it was in those years, so between 90 and 95, I decided to run for school trustee just to put my head up a little bit farther. So in 94, I ran to be a school trustee, and I had with my kids that, I call it the Norma Rae Moment. And if you've seen that movie where she pulls the kids out of bed and she says, they're going to be saying bad things about your mama. And I sat down with my kids and I made a decision then that my political career, such as it was, I didn't know what it was going to be, but I knew that I was going to be open about it from the beginning because there was no point in not being open. People knew who we were. There was nothing in me that wanted to hide that, but it meant that I put all of us out there. I put the kids out there. I put Jane out in a way that she hadn't necessarily been before, and that made us more of a lightning rod. But here's what happened. What happened was, over the years, because we lived there for many years after that, I think for some of the young kids, particularly on the street, and I know Kevin can speak to this later, but my kids had friends who have subsequently come out, and I'm pretty sure we were a bit of a beacon for some of those kids. Because they got to talk about issues that kids in another neighborhood might not have been able to in North Toronto. And they got to sit in the car with Jane when she was driving them to games, and if they used gay in a derogatory way, they got a lecture, whether they wanted it or not. So I think that transformation from lightning rod to beacon, although it was painful, actually did happen a little bit. And that is not obviously what we were looking for, but it is what happened, and it became part of the story, so that in 2005, when the legislation changed on same-sex marriage, my kids turned to me, and remember, I had been married before, and the institution is fine, but it's not something that I necessarily thought we needed to adopt and that I needed to go into again. I thought Jane and I could live our lives, and we'd worked through with Phil. I didn't think we needed to get married, but my kids turned to me and to Jane, and they said, because you can, now you have to get married. So they were calling on us to be beacons because it was possible. And they knew that it was going to be important to the young people in their world who would see this couple who had some profile and was older, taking that on. So we did. We got married at Fairlawn Avenue United Church, and that was a great thing. The second part of my journey that I want to talk a little, just briefly about, kind of morphs from that, and that is my election campaigns. There was not one election campaign, and I ran 5 times to be MPP. I ran twice to be school trustee, lost one of those and won one of those, and I ran 2 nominations, and I won and lost some of those. And in every single campaign, homophobia was either overt or it was whispered. There were whisper campaigns, or in some of my campaigns there were literally literature drops saying this extremist lesbian, and that was the language that they used. I don't know if Mary Louise remembers that, but the extremist lesbian Kathleen Wynne wants to be school trustee and is going to be a danger to your children. And at those all candidates meetings, people would come. I remember one in particular at Lawrence Park Collegiate, and there was a campaign. This was a school trustee campaign, and there was a campaign among some parents to show up at all the all candidates meetings, and with their babies, as though I didn't have babies, they would bring their babies as though somehow I was going to destroy family values. So there was a concerted effort. Sometimes it was as subtle as I would knock on a door during my MPP campaigns, and you know, someone would come to the door and say, "Oh, you're the lesbian who lives outside the riding with her girlfriend." I lived 14 doors outside the riding, but so it was that kind of campaign. So what that taught me was that we had to be aware of that, we had to understand that that was happening, and we had to confront it. And, you know, the riding that I represent here, this riding, is one of the most diverse ridings in the country. It has people from all over the world speaking 90 or 100 different languages, and different cultural backgrounds, different social mores, and in that first campaign in 2003, we knocked on 40,000 doors, and I talked to so many hundreds and hundreds of those people. And we came to an understanding. Many of the people who came from communities where there was an assumption that someone from the LGBTQ+ community could not be elected, could not be accepted. We had a conversation about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and we talked about how the Charter protects me and it protects you, and that's the beauty of this country. And so that distance between us started to break down because we had open conversations. And when I decided to run for the leadership of the party in 2012, there were people within the party who came to me and said, "You can't become the premier because you're a lesbian, so you should not run for the leadership." And so I had to listen to that, I had to hear that, and then I had to make a decision on my own. And that is so much of what people in the LGBTQ+ community have to do. They have to hear the concerns, and they have to understand, or try to understand. We have to try to understand where people are coming from, but then we have to live our lives, and we have to be, whether it's a lightning rod at first and then a beacon, we have to make that choice. And it is so much easier when there are people around us to support us. And that's what Lawrence Park Community Church is doing today, is creating a community of people to stand around people who are making those very difficult choices on a day-to-day basis. The last thing I will say is that as Premier, you know, I'd gone through that process to 2013 of dealing with the homophobia, dealing with the doubts, and realizing that in that role as Premier, I had the opportunity to be a beacon. And by the time I was the Premier, I did understand that it was that role modeling, it was the opportunity to take on that role as beacon that was so much more important than the obvious lightning rod that I was. Of course I was a lightning rod. As I say to people, you only have to look at my social media feed to know how many people don't think I'm a lovely person, you know. But the fact is that being a beacon and going to a high school and having kids ask whether they were allowed to have a gay-straight alliance with the principal in the room, and understanding that the child was asking me if it was okay for them to have a gay-straight alliance because they were in a conflict with their principal and they needed the principal to hear a person in authority say, yeah, actually that's the law. You actually are allowed to have a gay-straight alliance. You actually are allowed to have a safe environment in the school that you go to. But I'll tell you, to this day, within the last 6 months, 8 months, I have been in conversation with and have delegated to school boards in this province that still are not complying with those policies. Mostly Catholic boards, and I say that sadly, but that's the fact, that there are school boards in this province who still are trying to find a way around words that make them uncomfortable and concepts that they don't want their children to be exposed to, as if they can prevent their kids from being exposed to the diversity of our world. So by the time I was Premier, I understood why it was so important that I was a beacon, and I have had hundreds of encounters with young people, with parents, with grandparents who have come to me and said, I'm so glad you're there because my son or my daughter or my grandchild is struggling or is gay or whatever it is. I had an athlete come to me during the Pan-Parapan Games and say, when you became the Premier, I came out to my parents. This was this strapping young woman who was so competent, and she came out to her family on the strength of my being the Premier. So, being a beacon is an important role, and that is part of what you are doing. You're moving us forward. It's a celebration today of that web of relationships that in our world we try to emulate that love of God. I really believe that, and we so need examples like yours today as much as we did 20 years ago. You're striving to let that love shine through, and you're being successful. And it always comes down to this for me, that the harsh and ugly debate about the rights of LGBTQ2S+ people to exist, to marry, to preach, to teach, and all those debates that rage in churches and in countries around the world is at its root about a human being's right to love another human being. That's all it's about. And that song that the kids sang is what it's about. And that's what the fight is. And so thank you for doing this work. Thank you for going through this process and for leading the way. When I came out in 1990, and this is just, I'll end on this because this is the part I didn't say. When I came out in 1990, and Jane and Phil and my kids and I were struggling to hold our family together and make sense of what we were all going through, it was Fairlawn Church that stood by us. It was the church women, particularly, who reached out to Jane and made it a safe place for us. And so that's what you're going to do. You're going to create an environment where people you don't even know are struggling, kids you don't even know are questioning, will be safe, and you'll only know about it later. So thank you so much, and God bless.